She thought cutting a lock was just another petty power move, the kind of thing HOA bullies do to prove they're in control. But this time, the stakes were far higher than she could ever imagine. In a single reckless moment, she went from being an entitled neighbor to crossing a line she could never step back from. What she took wasn't just someone's Jeep. It was something tied to a force she should have never tangled with. The question is, how far can arrogance go before it collides with justice? Marcus never thought much about the neighborhood's HOA. He had moved into the quiet community for its tree-lined streets, good schools, and the promise of peace. His job with a specialized police task force was demanding, and home was supposed to be a sanctuary, the place where the noise of the world finally faded. The Jeep he parked in his driveway wasn't just a vehicle. It was his lifeline, outfitted with equipment and tools critical to his work. It was the one constant that connected his personal life to his professional duty. Neighbors saw Marcus as polite but private, someone who waved from a distance and kept to himself. He wasn't the type to show off or pick fights, which is why he quickly stood out in a community where some residents thrived on control. The HOA board, particularly a woman named Karen, was infamous for nitpicking every small detail, from lawn lengths to mailbox paint. For Marcus, it was background noise, irritating but manageable, until it wasn't. Small warnings had started appearing. Notes tucked under his wiper blades about unauthorized parking, even though his Jeep sat in his own driveway. Emails from the HOA suggesting he was in violation of rules he'd never heard of. He brushed them aside, convinced it was nothing more than the usual HOA theatrics. But behind those papers and petty messages, Karen's obsession was sharpening. She didn't see Marcus as a neighbor. She saw him as a problem to eliminate, a challenge to her sense of authority. And in a community where the HOA's power could feel like law, she believed no one could stand against her. Yet, Marcus wasn't just any homeowner. His life was built around discipline, responsibility, and a commitment to something far greater than HOA politics. And while he never flaunted that side of himself, it silently defined every choice he made. What Karen saw as weakness, his quiet nature, his avoidance of confrontation, was something entirely different. It was patience. It was control. As the days passed, tension grew in visible threads around his home. Karen watched, waited, and cataloged every imagined offense. To her, the Jeep wasn't just a violation. It was a symbol she needed to crush. For Marcus, it was a necessity he couldn't afford to lose. Their paths were on a collision course, neither willing to yield, though only one of them truly understood the stakes. What began as neighborhood friction was about to escalate into something unthinkable. And when the lock on Marcus's property snapped under Karen's determination, the fragile line between petty HOA disputes and life-changing consequences shattered with it. The first real sign that things were spiraling came late one Friday evening. Marcus returned home after a long shift, exhaustion pulling at every step. His Jeep sat in the driveway, dusted with pollen from the spring air. But something else caught his eye. A bright orange violation notice slapped across the windshield, its words bold and unyielding. Unauthorized vehicle. Remove immediately or face penalties. Marcus read the note twice, his jaw tightening. Unauthorized? This was his property, his driveway. The Jeep wasn't some abandoned wreck. It was clean, maintained, and vital for his work. He crumpled the paper, tossing aside, unwilling to give Karen the satisfaction of a reaction. But the message was clear. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was personal. Over the next few days, Karen's campaign escalated. More notices appeared, sometimes two in a single day. Neighbors whispered about seeing her circling Marcus's driveway, phone in hand, snapping pictures of the Jeep like it was evidence for a crime. One evening, Marcus caught her standing across the street, arms folded, staring at his house as if daring him to confront her. He didn't take the bait. But Karen wasn't satisfied with silent intimidation. She took her complaints to the HOA board, demanding immediate action. At the next community meeting, whispers rippled through the room as she stood up, pointing fingers at Marcus for bringing down the neighborhood's image. She described his Jeep as an eyesore, claiming it violated rules about non-standard vehicles. What she didn't mention was her obsession with control, or her simmering resentment toward Marcus, who represented something she could never dominate. Marcus wasn't in the room to defend himself. He was on duty, working late into the night, ensuring others were safe. To Karen, his absence was proof that he didn't care about the community. To Marcus, it was simply the reality of his responsibility. Soon, Karen began recruiting others to her cause. A few board members, swayed by her relentless energy, started parroting her claims. Notices from the HOA turned into fines, each one more absurd than the last. The injustice was infuriating, but Marcus kept his composure. He knew reacting rashly would only fuel Karen's fire. Still, the weight of her harassment pressed heavier with each passing day. Then came the breaking point. It was a quiet Sunday morning when Marcus woke to an unusual stillness outside. No children playing, no lawnmowers buzzing, no neighbors walking dogs. Just silence, broken only by the faint clink of metal against metal. Marcus peered out the window, and his stomach dropped. Karen stood in his driveway, bolt cutters gripped tightly in her hands. Hunched over the lock, securing his Jeep, her movements were frantic, almost desperate, as if every squeeze of the cutters was a release of pent-up rage. Marcus froze for a split second, disbelief rooting him in place. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was invasion. This was theft. With one final snap, the lock gave way. Karen straightened, tossing it aside with a smug flick of her wrist, and climbed into the driver's seat of the Jeep. Marcus's heart pounded. His Jeep wasn't just a personal vehicle. It was tied to his work, loaded with gear and records that weren't meant for prying eyes. The thought of Karen tearing through it, or worse, driving it away, sent a wave of dread coursing through him. He rushed toward the door, but Karen was already moving. The Jeep roared to life, and with a screech of tires against pavement, she pulled out of his driveway. Marcus stood in the doorway, fists clenched, watching as his Jeep disappeared down the street. The neighborhood stirred awake. Curtains twitched, doors cracked open. Neighbors stepped outside, confusion spreading as they realized what happened. Some whispered, others shook their heads, but no one intervened. Karen's power was rooted not in rules, but in fear. Many had learned the hard way that standing against her came with a price. And so, they watched in silence as Marcus's world tilted off balance. Hours crawled by before Karen returned. The Jeep rolled back into the driveway. But something was different. It wasn't just that the lock was gone or that the vehicle had been moved without permission. It was a look on Karen's face. Gone was the smugness, replaced by a nervous tension that she tried and failed to mask. Neighbors noticed it too. Karen didn't linger in the driveway, didn't strut or lecture. She simply parked, climbed out, and hurried away as though chased by something unseen. Marcus walked slowly to his Jeep, dread tightening with each step. From the outside, nothing seemed damaged, but inside, he knew the truth. Karen had no idea what she'd interfered with. The Jeep wasn't just his. It was tethered to a force far bigger, far stronger than any HOA. As he checked the vehicle, relief mingled with fury. The equipment was still intact, untouched, but the violation itself was staggering. Karen had crossed a line, not only against him but against the law. And yet, Marcus didn't rush to confront her. Not yet, because he knew something Karen didn't. Her reckless act had set into motion consequences she couldn't control. The Jeep wasn't just under his watch. It was under the watch of the police task force. Karen thought she had won a battle by cutting a lock and flexing her authority. In reality, she had walked blindly into a storm she could never escape. And as whispers spread across the neighborhood, and the weight of what she'd done began to sink in, Marcus prepared for the moment when the full force of justice would finally crash down. Karen believed she had broken a stubborn neighbor. What she didn't know was that she had broken into something far more dangerous. And the consequences of that choice were already on their way. The fallout came faster than anyone expected. By the next morning, Marcus's neighborhood buzzed with unease. The Jeep sat in his driveway as though nothing had happened, but the truth was far darker. Karen's reckless stunt hadn't just crossed Marcus's line. It crossed the line of law enforcement itself. The task force had been monitoring the vehicle remotely, its GPS tracker logging every movement. When the Jeep left Marcus's driveway unauthorized, silent alarms had been triggered. To Karen, It had been nothing more than an act of petty dominance. To the police, it looked like a breach, possibly even an attempted theft of government property. Marcus knew what was coming, but Karen didn't. She still strutted around the neighborhood, tossing self-congratulatory remarks to anyone within earshot, framing her bold move as a victory against rule breakers. She thought she had shown strength. In reality, she had painted herself into a corner, and the walls were closing in. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, the quiet community was shattered by the arrival of unmarked vehicles. Dark SUVs rolled into the neighborhood, their presence heavy and unmistakable. Doors slammed and men and women in plain clothes but with unmistakable authority stepped out, moving with precision. Neighbors peered from windows, drawn to spectacle yet too afraid to step outside. Karen, caught off guard, emerged from her porch with that same tight-lipped smile she wore when issuing demands at HOA meetings. But the smile faltered as two officers approached her directly. They weren't interested in small talk. Their questions were sharp, their tone firm. Had she been in possession of Marcus's Jeep? Did she have authorization to tamper with secured vehicle? Each word stripped the color from her face. For Marcus, watching from his porch, it was a surreal moment. The woman who had wielded power over him and so many others in the community now stood trembling, her voice cracking under the weight of questions she couldn't answer. Her hands shook, her composure slipping with every second. Karen tried to shift the blame, pointing toward Marcus's house, claiming she was only enforcing HOA rules. But her excuses crumbled. The officers weren't there to debate neighborhood bylaws. They were there because she had interfered with a police task force vehicle, an offense that went far beyond any HOA complaint. The more she spoke, the deeper she dug herself. Neighbors had gathered by now, quietly forming clusters at the edge of their lawns. For years, they had endured Karen's tyranny, but now they were witnessing her unravel in real time. The woman who had silenced them with threats of fines and rules now stammered, exposed, and utterly powerless. Marcus felt no joy in watching her fall apart. What he felt was heavier, deeper. This wasn't just about his Jeep anymore. It was about every person who had been bullied into silence, every neighbor who had felt smaller, because Karen needed to feel bigger. This was justice, raw and unflinching, playing out under the same streetlight she once used as her stage. Then came the words that shifted the entire atmosphere. You tamper with government property. That's a federal offense. Gasps rippled through the neighborhood. Karen's knees seemed to weaken, her bravado gone, replaced by a desperate plea for understanding. She tried to laugh it off, to suggest it was a misunderstanding. But the officer's stern expressions left no room for doubt. In that moment, everything flipped. The fear she had instilled in others was now her own. The power she clung to evaporated, leaving her exposed in front of the very people she had ruled over. Marcus watched silently, his expression unreadable. He didn't gloat, didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, a quiet reminder that strength doesn't need a shout. The officers didn't drag Karen away in handcuffs. Not yet. But the investigation had begun, and the message was unmistakable. Her reign of intimidation was over. She had poked at something far larger than herself, and now the consequences would follow her like a shadow she could never outrun. The neighborhood stood still, caught between shock and relief. The sight of Karen, once untouchable, now cornered, was a turning point none of them would ever forget. And as the officer's final words echoed across the cul-de-sac, Marcus knew the battle was no longer his to fight. Karen had crossed into a realm where her title, her HOA rules, and her arrogance meant nothing. She had tangled with something far greater than her own authority. And this time, the outcome would not be hers to control. Karen thought she had power over one man's Jeep. What she didn't realize was that she had just ignited a reckoning, one that would change the neighborhood forever. In the days that followed, the neighborhood felt like a place transformed. The Jeep remained safely in Marcus's driveway, a quiet symbol of both what had been threatened and what had been protected. But Karen, once the self-proclaimed guardian of community standards, was no longer strutting across lawns or posting notices on doors. Instead, she kept her distance, her authority stripped away not by an HOA vote, but by the weight of consequences she never imagined she would face. For Marcus, The ordeal carried a heavier meaning than simple relief. On the surface, yes, the lock cutting and attempted theft had been stopped, and his Jeep and the work it represented remained secure. But beneath that, the incident revealed something deeper about the world he lived in. Karen's actions had never truly been about a vehicle. They were about control, about the way entitlement could dress itself as authority, and about how quickly someone could target a man who looked different, acted different, or simply didn't bend to their will. Neighbors began speaking out in hushed but growing voices. Some admitted they had received their own share of harassment over small things: a garden too wild, a car parked too long, a paint color slightly off. Others confessed that they had stayed silent because they didn't want to become Karen's next target. It was only when Marcus's Jeep became the center of her obsession, and the police became involved, that they realized how fragile their peace had been all along. What shook many the most was this: Karen hadn't just underestimated Marcus. She had dismissed him. She saw only what she wanted to see: a quiet man, easy to push around, someone whose silence could be mistaken for weakness. She never saw the depth of his discipline, the purpose behind his composure, or the life he led outside the narrow lanes of her HOA rules. That blindness wasn't just personal. It echoed a broader pattern, one seen far too often in the world beyond their cul-de-sac. Because how many times has someone in power written off another human being simply because of who they are, or because they don't fit the mold of what's acceptable? How many times has arrogance, rooted in prejudice, turned small disputes into battles with life-changing consequences? For Marcus, the answer wasn't just in his own experience. It was in countless stories he had heard, and in the weight of history that too often repeated itself. His Jeep could be repaired, locks could be replaced, but the truth was harder to fix. The reality that justice is not always given freely, but demanded at great cost. And yet, there was also a quiet victory. Not in Karen's downfall alone, but in the way the community began to shift. The silence that once protected her began to crack. Neighbors, emboldened by what they had witnessed, started to challenge the culture of fear she had built. The HOA meetings changed tone. Whispers turned into open questions. For the first time in years, people realized they had a voice, and they began to use it. Marcus never sought applause. He never wanted to be the center of a neighborhood spectacle. All he wanted was peace, a safe place to return after long nights spent serving others. But through this ordeal, he became more than just a target. He became a reminder that dignity, discipline, and quiet strength can stand taller than arrogance, and that sometimes the most powerful justice comes not in the shouting of the aggressor, but in the calm exposure of their weakness. As the weeks rolled on, Karen's influence dwindled to almost nothing. The HOA board, once a shield for her control, distanced itself from her, unwilling to be dragged further into the shadow of her choices. The neighborhood, slowly but surely, reclaimed the peace she had stolen. And Marcus, he moved forward. But he carried with him the reminder that this wasn't just about one Jeep, one Karen, or one neighborhood. It was about a truth far bigger. That injustice, no matter how small it seems, always leaves a mark. And when ignored, it grows until someone has the courage, or the misfortune, to stand against it. So, the question remains: how many more communities will wait for arrogance to destroy itself before they stand together for what's right? And how many more people must face injustice in silence before their story is finally heard?